But the highest form of love is when you give to the beggar out of love. When you're motivated by the raging fire of love, that's the best situation. And in fact, recent studies in empirical psychology have shown that we're very unlikely to even be just to people who are different from us if we don't have empathy. And so we don't care if we drop bombs in Iraqis after 9/11, and we don't care because we don't have empathy for Arabs or Iraqis or people that far away. If we had empathy, it would bother us that bombs got dropped onto children. And I don't mean this as a political judgment. It's just, this is the human condition. If we don't have empathy, we aren't going to act justly, and we're not going to care if people are victims of injustice. That's just the way it is empirically.
Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Forum. I'm so glad you're here. I'm just going to say thank you to Dakota for donating to the Spiritual Forum podcast. I really appreciate my donations. And you can also subscribe to the newsletter, engage on YouTube or any of the podcast apps. Love to hear from you. This is a podcast that is about hope, inspiration, and awakening. And I cover a broad range of topics, but all of them are centered on some way on hope, inspiration, and awakening, because I think that's something that we could all use in this world. So I hope that you are inspired, and let me know exactly how this podcast inspires you. So let me introduce you to my guest. His name is Kelly James Clark. He got his PhD from University of Notre Dame. He's a distinguished professor of philosophy at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. He's held previous positions and appointments at multiple universities, including Oxford, University of St. Andrews, Peking University, and the University of Notre Dame. He writes boldly and he writes broadly and speaks widely on compassion, tolerance, and peace. And he is the author of more than 30 books. And his most recent book is called Raging Fire of Love: What I Learned from Jesus, the Jews, and the Prophet. And that's going to be our focus of our conversation today. So welcome, Dr. Clark.
Hi, Carol. Kelly, please, from now on. And I like write boldly. So that was a nice mispronunciation. I like that.
Yeah, I thought so too. You do write boldly. I think that was something that just slipped through. So I'd love to know, Kelly, I did read your book, and I really, really enjoy being in interfaith dialogues myself. One of my ordinations is interfaith. And so I think it's just a really, really great place for us all to kind of meet. And I'd like to know how you got involved in that. And just basically, why don't you give us a story, your spiritual story and your background, and then we'll go from there.
All right. Thanks. I backed into interfaith. There was nothing ever very deliberate about it. In fact, I grew up basically a fundamentalist Christian and was anti-interfaith. I didn't think I had much to say or to learn from anybody in any other tradition. Not only, not Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus. I didn't think I had much to learn from Christians who weren't in my denomination. So I didn't think I had much to learn from Baptists and especially Catholics. And I'm pretty sure that when I was an undergrad that I thought all Catholics were going to hell because they didn't believe exactly as I believed. And I made a big mistake. And I went to University of Notre Dame, a Catholic university, for my PhD program. And I met a lot of really nice Catholics, and I just couldn't find myself believing anymore that Catholics were going to hell. I just couldn't do it. But them Muslims, I thought there's a group I can look down on, and it would be another 20 or 25 years before I had, I'd say, transformative encounters with Muslims and came to the conclusion that I just couldn't find myself believing that they were going to hell. And in fact, I'm not a really big fan of hell anymore anyways, but I was, when I was an undergrad, I was a big fan of it. And I was pretty happy there were lots of people who weren't like me who were going there. Now I just find that utterly repulsive, but I thought it was a virtue then. With respect to how things broaden into Islam and Judaism and Islam. I had a sabbatical at St. Andrews University, and one of my colleagues there was a Jewish professor from Ohio State University, and we took regular walks. Sometimes we jogged together, and we talked. We talked and talked and talked. And he invited me into his home. I met his family. I had a Shabbat service there, which I write about in the book. And he he did two things to me. One is he opened up the world of Judaism to me, and the other was that he challenged my unbelievably naive conviction that Christians were kind and compassionate.
Mm.
And Jews, of course, have been on the receiving end of Christian compassion, I say with scare quotes, for 2,000 years. And he thought I needed to face that and to write more boldly, really, about compassion and compassion towards people who are different from you. And he's the first one that got me to write on the topic. And the topics initially wrote on were liberty and tolerance. And I wrote to an academic audience, and I've made serious moves in the past 25 years to write to a much, much broader audience. And that involved, after 9/11, getting to know and cultivate friendships with Muslims and the whole the world of Islam, but also the world of Muslims opened up to me through my friendships with Muslims. And I did a lot of academic projects. I had $1 million project on randomness and providence in the Abrahamic tradition. So I had 12 prominent Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars, one from each tradition. There were 36 or 40 people involved in that project. But I used it to try to bring people together, to get thought leaders to come together, to build some bridges. And even though academics should know better, we don't. We can have fears and be bigots just like anybody else. And we had a lot uh, of wide divides in the group that we had to work to overcome. And I worked in Interfaith Institute for a number of years. I mostly do international projects with academics. I teach at a university in Istanbul. I'm not a Muslim, but I have many Muslim friends there. And I do a lot of projects that try to bring Muslim, Christians, and Jewish thought leaders together to build bridges over what I think are some pretty big divides.
That is really, really interesting. I think that you had to repent. I mean,
Yes,
you start off talking
exactly. Many repentances.
many repentances. You've had to really change your mind.
Yeah.
You've had to really change your mind. And so did that happen just in the individual relationships that you had with the Jewish man, or did it, because that's what's so interesting to me. How you can go from I delight in all these others going to hell. And I'm paraphrasing, but it
Yeah.
kind of sounded that
But
way.
you're pretty close.
Okay.
You're not
I
misreading.
I misread it, yeah.
I think there's a kind of young man's delight in, I don't know, severity and power. And
Yes.
so I think young men especially are inclined to think that to think of God in terms of severity and power and not in terms of compassion. And I don't know, it had a certain attraction to me at a certain age. And there's this other attraction that the world when I was younger was really black and white. And the older you get, the grayer the world gets, the more ambiguous things are. If you're paying attention, I think you begin to realize that we have less information than we might have thought. Um,
Mhm, mhm.
and then I just slowly began to think that other people are pretty much like me, and they're doing the best they can to figure out what reality is like with a capital R. With, as T.S. Eliot says about writing, with shabby equipment always deteriorating. I I think our minds are more suited to fighting and farming than they are to philosophy, to figuring out the nature of ultimate reality. So I think we have kind of finite creaturely minds, and we lack fully adequate information. And we all do. So
Mhm,
I've
mhm.
come to respect people who hold views that are different from mine. I sometimes think that that my information is better. That's why I believe what I believe, but I don't think I'm better. I don't think I did anything better or thought harder or anything like that. And I don't have a great sense that my information is any better than their information. This is my information. We all like our own beliefs, so and we don't like to change them very easily. I think that's part of what you noted in your comment. We're all belief conservatives. We like to conserve as much of our precious beliefs as we can, and we're not
Mhm,
really
mhm.
open to much change in these matters. And and if I hadn't met people who were kind and compassionate, I think I wouldn't have changed. If I had just stayed with people who were closed off like I was, I would have been happily closed off the rest of my life, and then not knowing about all these great people and traditions and foods and poems and dances and music that are out there in the world to find out about.
Don't you think it takes like a curiosity? I think curiosity is so powerful that if we have a curious mind, then we're open to new information and we don't stay so firmly stuck on our own traditions and beliefs. If we just have a little curiosity, then then something can open to just gain more
Yeah.
information and a connection that might not happen otherwise.
Yeah. I just think we need to have our eyes open way more than we do, and because there are things to see, and you're not gonna see them if your eyes aren't open, if you're not looking around. Uh, I There's a great medieval world called docility, and it doesn't mean that you're lazy or docile. It means that you're teachable, and it's a virtue, like docility is a virtue, and it means that you're teachable. And I tell my daughter, who lived in the Middle East and worked in the Middle East for 6 or 7 years, and my daughter's younger than I am, and she has different beliefs, or beliefs that came more easily to her than they did to me. Beliefs about homosexuality and homosexuals, about women, about all sorts of different things in society.
Mhm.
And it's hard sometimes to hear what she has to say, to find out that I'm not so virtuous in these areas. And I tell my daughter, Emily, one thing you should know about me is I am teachable. You can tell me and I will
Ah,
ponder it. I'm teachable. So don't give up on me.
I like that teachability as a virtue, docility as a virtue. One of
Yeah.
the things you say in your book that I think you're describing is fear loves groups, but love is local. And I think that it's so easy to be in a group. We're very social creatures.
Yeah.
So we gather with our own group. Religion is one, or church or spiritual community is one way we gather. Political is another way. There's all sorts of ways we gather as groups. And then as a group, it's so easy for fear to come in and then otherize the other groups.
Yeah.
But what
Yep.
happened with you in your opening and becoming teachable and becoming more open to the views of others and experience of others is you had local experiences. So if we can localize our experiences, and that's where love can creep in.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I think if we don't, so fear does two things. One is it drives us into our own groups and keeps us there. I had a friend who taught at a nearby seminary, and he asked his students to keep a diary of all the places and people that they met over the course of a week. And so these are seminary students. Most of them are adults with children now. It's not so common for 22-year-olds to go to seminary. It's more common for someone who's
Mhm.
32 to go to seminary. So they're mostly adults with children. So of course on Sundays they went to Sunday school and then to church, and then they had meals maybe with family or friends who were from church. They went back for evening church. They There's a Christian Yellow Pages in Grand Rapids, so they'd go to a Christian mechanic, or they hire a Christian
Mm.
carpenter. They went to midweek services with Christians. Their kids went to Christian schools. So by the end of the week, they had a list of all the people that they had met, and they were all people exactly like them. And so I think fear keeps us in groups, and I think there's good reasons, like good old long evolutionary reasons why fear keeps us in groups, but it also creates out groups, and then we tend to treat people who aren't in our group, we tend to think of them in terms of their group, and then that's in terms of stereotypes, and that's how we become, you know, prejudiced and bigots about
Mhm.
people who aren't in our group. So we think Mexicans are lazy. We think Muslims are violent. We think Jews are cheap and will cheat you. We tend to think of people who are other than us in terms of stereotypes, we think apply to the group. And so I think compassion requires courage. Like you have to take a step. Sometimes it has to be you. I look back in my past and I think, thank God that other people just reached out to me. And and now I am bolder. Like I'll walk almost anywhere and start a conversation with almost anyone. I'll go up to a person when I give a talk in the Middle East who looks the most like a Muslim terrorist, and I'll ask if I can take a selfie with them. I don't do this out of the blue, like if they've come to my lecture to hear what I have to say, there's a student or something, and I'll explain to them. They'll have heard me, what I have to say. I use Facebook and Instagram and Twitter to normalize our Westerners' views of Muslims. I want them to know you can walk in these places and they don't wanna kill you. And they know we have a laugh at our biases, but compassion takes some boldness because fear wants to keep us in groups, and it wants to keep us away from out groups, and it wants us to put down out groups. And fear is way more powerful than love. We may say love makes the world go round, but if only. Fear makes the world go round, and we need to break cycles of fear.
Okay, so let's turn to these three different faith traditions because, like you say, we do stay in our own. So if we're Christian, we know the New Testament, and if we're Jewish, we know the Torah. If we're Muslim, we know the Quran,
Yeah,
and we don't really dip ourselves into the other texts or traditions so much. And so we basically get some sound bites from whoever tells us what the sound bites
yeah,
are,
yeah,
whether it's the news or your group or your leader or whatever. And you hypothesize or you put forth the idea that these texts are books of love and that these traditions are basically about love and compassion at their root. And I'd like to hear more about that from you. So maybe you can kind of go through that and then we can talk more
yeah,
about it.
yeah. So, I don't think it would be hard to persuade Christians that their,
You're right.
authoritative book, their text is about love. It's not that hard to persuade, Christians. They say God is love, that's God's most essential nature. So we Christians say that, but lots of times when we talk about people who are different from us, gays or Muslims or other people who are different from us, we often quote the Old Testament where God is really vengeful, or there are passages that are really vicious towards different practices that are different from our own. So I think it's ironic that the New Testament is so utterly clear that God is love and that we're to treat one another in love. And by one another, I mean neighbor, stranger, and even enemy. It's really clear
Right.
in the New Testament. In one of the Gospels, Jesus says, "Look, it's easy for anyone to be nice to their neighbor or to people who are a lot like them. That's easy, but I call you to love your enemy." And I think that's a part that we've left out, that Christians have left out. We know it's in there. If asked, we would say it, but we don't act like it animates our lives at all. And I think sadly what this has done, and of course it did it to me, is that I thought Christianity was the best religion because it was the religion of love. Jews are the religion of like tribe. God calls these people and brings them together. And Islam is a religion of justice. Love in Judaism is just for people in your tribe. Love in Islam is almost non existent because God will justly punish people who are overall bad, and he'll be good to people who are overall good. Like where's the love in Islam? And so what I do in my book is I really dive deeply into the authoritative texts of each of the traditions. So I look into the Hebrew Bible, and in the Hebrew Bible, it's pretty clear to me that when God blesses Abraham, he says to Abraham, that I've called you Abraham, because he's given Abraham a message and a task. And the message to Abraham and the task to Abraham is that I will bless all the nations through you and through his descendants. I'll bless everybody. Everyone's included. It's not just your family or your extended family or people who believe like you. I'm going to bless everyone through you, Abraham. And then there's a passage that I spent a lot of time on, or a book in the Hebrew Bible, the Song of Songs, which, if you didn't know it was in the Hebrew Bible, you might think it is what it is. And what is it? I think it's an erotic love poem between a young man and a young woman. And I think they're about 16 or 17, and their hormones are firing. And so a lot of the metaphors are about the mounds in the mountain. And it's your breasts are like hammocks or whatever, there's all sorts of images in there that you might expect of a agrarian community 2,000 years ago, but they are about the love of a young man and a young woman. And in fact, it's where I get the title of the book. I'll read the passage in here, but this is this is from the woman to the man. She says, "Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love is as strong as death, passion fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, a raging flame." So I find this amazingly powerful and beautiful. And it's beautiful in a lot of ways. For one thing, it's the woman saying to the man, "Set me as a seal upon your heart." And I think women were sealed to men almost as slaves in the old age, but as subservient. And she says, "I'm not sealed that way. I want to be sealed on your heart. Set me as a seal
Mhm.
on your heart." So it's a love among equals in here. So I think it's a really beautiful affirmation of how love should be, love among equals, among humans. Love is strong in death, passion fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, a raging flame. So here's what the rabbis had to do. They had to figure out how this erotic love poem, which is in Holy Scripture for them, could have been some sort of revelation from God. And when God is never mentioned, not once in the Song of Songs. And what the rabbis decided was that it's a metaphor about God's love for Israel and Israel's love for God. And so I take it that way. Yep, that's what it is. And I think it's a metaphor for our love for one another. And what's often missing in Abrahamic religious, maybe other traditions are better than this. What's often missing from love, for at least for other people who are really different, what's often missing is the raging fire of love. And so what the traditions will tell you is that love is an act. Love is an action. Love is something you do. Love doesn't care about what you think or feel. And what I figured out was, in the Hebrew Bible, in the New Testament, in the Quran, they do care about what you feel and how you feel. And they want us to love with a raging fire. So any other kind of love, so love is an act. Don't get me wrong. There are loving acts. There are acts of mercy. There are things you are supposed to do for the poor, the widow, and the orphan, for the stranger, and even for the enemy. Love is an act. And if you can't drum up any feelings for those other people, if the beggar is too stinky for you, it's still a good thing to give to the beggar who's starving. So do it. That all three traditions are clear,
Mhm,
do it.
mhm.
But they're also saying, but the highest form of love is when you give to the beggar out of love. When you're motivated by the raging fire of love. That's the best situation. And in fact, recent studies in empirical psychology have shown that we're very unlikely to to even be just to people who are different from us if we don't have empathy.
Mm.
And so we don't care if we drop bombs in Iraqis after 9/11, and we don't care because we don't have empathy for Arabs or Iraqis or people that far away. If we had empathy, it would bother us that bombs got dropped onto children. And I don't mean this as a political judgment. It's just, this is the human condition. If we
Mhm.
don't have empathy, we aren't going to act justly, and we're not going to care if people are victims of injustice. That's just the way it is empirically. The I work in cognitive psychology as well as philosophy, and the cognitive psychology is clear. Without the raging fire of love, we're very unlikely to be loving towards people who are different from us. And what that means is we need to cultivate the raging fire. And I talk about it, how we might cultivate it, even though it seems like an impossible demand to love your enemy. And I think a really difficult demand to love the stranger. These are really difficult demands, but we're called to cultivate the raging fire of love. So that's what I got from the Hebrew Bible. I've talked about the New Testament a little bit. I'll just say a little bit about the Quran, which I think is probably the most important for American readers to understand that the Quran, forget what you think about it, forget what some preacher told you about Islam, which is probably where you got your information, and not the best source of information. Um, I think the best source of information about Islam is the Quran. And the Quran, except for one chapter, every chapter begins with a prayer to Allah, the compassionate, the merciful. Every chapter begins like that. And Muslims pray 5 times a day on their knees. They bow, and their prayers begin to Allah, the compassionate, the merciful. And why is that important? I think it's saying that compassion and mercy are at the heart of Allah. And when you're praying that, the point is that you're trying to cultivate that in your own heart, compassion and mercy in your own heart. So Islam does talk about God's power, and some Muslims focus on God's power, God's omnipotence. But I think the thing to remember is God is omnipotent, but it's omnipotence always tempered by compassion and mercy in Islam. So I think Muslims have a text that it shouldn't be inspiring them to violence, and it inspires very few people to violence. Very few Muslims are terrorists. So I don't even like to say it because I don't want to repeat a bias that we have in the West. Um, so it shouldn't do that. It should do what I see in a lot of Muslims when I visit. I should see hospitality and sharing and compassion and generosity. So anyway, that's what the Quran teaches. And I want people in each tradition to remind people in their own traditions of what their most authoritative texts say about compassion and peace.
Mhm, mhm. Well, first of all, I love how you keep saying the raging fire. That's the name of your book, The Raging Fire of Love. That's really a very, very literal and metaphorical way of speaking about love. I mean, raging
Yeah,
fire is not a quiet, complacent, silent thing. It is fire. I mean, it's an action. I mean, you can see what that would look like, and that. So you're saying we're really called to be an action as love. I think what happens is there's different levels of consciousness on this planet. I mean, there are all sorts of different levels of consciousness, and every single one of the religions has people at different levels, and so they're going to be interpreting texts that in accordance with their own perceptions. And so there's
yeah,
always going to
yeah,
be those fundamentalists in all of them. There's going to be the fundamentalists that are looking at that text and making everybody wrong, and we're the right ones. Everyone else is going to hell. We need to fight the others, and we've seen that happen. We've seen that happen through history. So I think we're just really kind of being called upward in consciousness, so that we can be expressing the raging fire of love. There is, though, and you do point to this in your book. There are some challenging texts or scriptures in all of these traditions, and so we need to face that right now. Like, what about those descriptions of God as a warring God, or has a very, very distinct personality that says, go conquer and pillage and all of that? I think we need to address that right now so that people can kind of understand
yeah,
what to do with
yeah,
that.
yeah. That's right. There are passages, by the way. I discuss at some length the passages in the Hebrew Bible where God tells him to go in and to land of Canaan and kill every man, woman, and child, and I think every animal. But So how are you supposed to understand that? And I think we need to come to terms with how it should be understood. And I deal with that one since it's in the Hebrew Bible from the Hebrew perspective. How have rabbis throughout Jewish history come to understand it, the text like that? And there's a wide variety of ways they've come to understand them. I think a lot of Christians like this sort of conquest emphasis in the Hebrew Bible, and so I have friends that I think don't mind what Israel is doing in Gaza right now. I myself think Israel has a right to exist and defend itself, so I don't think that they should do nothing, but it's hard to watch women and children get annihilated like that. But I have many Christians who think this is a good thing because God says, "He who attacks you, I will attack, and he who
Mhm,
defends you,
mhm.
I will defend." And so they don't mind. It seems not to bother them, but well, it bothers me. And I think we have to have better ways of understanding in this day and age various conquest passages. And I will say about the Quran, uh, the Quran is mostly a book, or a lot of the book. It's not mostly a book about this. A lot of the book is about having a just war. It's not, and so you can't attack innocent people. It says Muslims should never attack Muslims, so that's not right. There should be no Sunni Shia conflict anywhere over anything. The Quran is quite clear.
Mhm.
In the time of the Quran, the prophet ordered all the followers of the prophet to be kind and to think of Jews and Christians as fellow believers, as fellow submitters to Allah, and they should live in peace with Jews and Christians. And they're never allowed to go on offensive war. They're not allowed to instigate war. What are they allowed to do? They're allowed to defend themselves. And there are rules about how they can defend themselves. And also, I'll just say one last thing. If anyone comes, this is in the Quran, if anyone comes and asks for peace, you have to stop immediately and you have to listen to them and you have to talk about peace. So I view it as a really early and I think even profound document on just war. That
Mhm.
countries do have a right to defend, or people groups do have a right to defend themselves. But then there are rules for how you can defend yourself, and you have to follow those rules. And I think it's a book about how to make war, which happens sometimes, more humane. But it's not mostly a book about war. So anyway, I think it's not a book about conquest, even though I think many people take it to be that, including some Muslims take it to be that.
Yeah. As a unity minister, we look at the scriptures metaphysically. So we kind of get around a lot of this by
Yeah,
looking at the spiritual meaning, the symbolic meaning, and the story, what the story is telling us, and who are we in the story, and how are we growing spiritually through the story, and what was the historical context at the time. And so it
yeah,
kind of helps with being able to interpret some of these things that don't really make a lot of sense when you really fundamentally believe that God is love and that God reigns upon the righteous and the unrighteous, and the sun shines on
yeah,
everybody, and God loves everybody. And so there is this disconnect. And so I think whenever there's a disconnect, for me, just always go with love, go with love and release the tension with this other polarity, because the love, the raging fire of love as you describe it, just opens us up for just really evolving and connecting and growing together, which I do believe is the intention of the divine.
yeah, yeah. No, I totally agree, and I think Christians should have a healthier sense of the spiritual meaning of the whole of all these texts, and not cling to, I think, some of the earthier, grimier meanings that are rooted in cultures that are 2,500 years old, 3,000
So
years
different,
old. There
yeah,
are
where
better
we
ways
are.
to understand it,
I think
and I
that
don't think that even for them.
No, I don't think it was the point for them. I think they had other points, and then thousands of years later, we come back
Yeah,
and we look at what they said, and I think our egos get wrapped up in this. And I think that each one of these world religions, if you've got an ego that I'm the best and I'm right, you can take each one of these and justify that. The
Yeah.
the Jewish
Yeah.
tradition can say we were chosen. The Christian can say, well, we have the Son of God, the actual Son of God, and the Muslims can say, well, we have the very last prophet, and there's no more prophets after this. Each one of them can say there's something special about us.
Yeah.
And that's where I think that
Yeah.
raging fire of love you're talking about, though, transcends the ego. It's like that's not who we want to be. If we're going to be in action on this planet as love, we've got to drop those ego concerns that make us think that we're the best or better. And that's really, I think, what you're talking about. I would love for you to talk about the first, second, and third degrees of love that you mentioned in your book.
Yeah. So there was a song by, I think it was Alabama, "Love in the First Degree," and I try to use some songs to help people remember some of the points here. And the guy sings, "I'm guilty, guilty of love in the first degree." And so I ask about what is love in the first degree, and I try to use it to make the case, just sort of thinking about it without looking carefully at the text, to make the case that love in the first degree is love with the raging fire. And so I look at murder, something that's it's more common to think of first degree in terms of murder than it is in terms of love. That, someone that's guilty of third degree murder may have killed somebody, but they probably did it by accident. We don't think they intended it. So maybe they were out driving and looking at their cell phone and they killed somebody. And we don't think that's the worst kind of murder. It's bad. A life was taken, shouldn't happen, but there's no intention. And in the second degree may be that you didn't plan on it, but you did intend it, like, pretty quickly. It wasn't some big, huge setup that you had. Maybe you got really mad at your neighbor who's been playing loud music at night, and what you wanna do is blast them with your voice, and they make you really angry, and you pull out your pistol that you happen to be packing at the time. Because what would Jesus pack? That's and you pull out your pistol, and you literally blast them and kill them. Well, you didn't go over planning to kill them. You went over planning to get them to stop playing their music at night, but you did intend it, in that second. But it's not a kind of fixed part of your character to go and do that. And then love in the first degree is where you intend, murder is where you intend to kill somebody. You make a plan and then you act, and it's often out of some sort of fixed part of our character. And so I take love to be, sometimes people do loving acts, but they don't intend them. And that's love in the first degree. Maybe love in the second degree, a beggar comes up and you don't want to be bothered. So you give them $1 and they go away. But you do an act, you intend it, but you don't really care that much. And love in the
Mhm.
first degree is where you actually do care, and then you plan it, and then you act based on your plan, and it becomes more part of your character for you to do that. So in each case, there's an act of love. Those are all good. And the acts of murder are all bad, but acts of love are all good. But the final one, the love where you intend it, where it's a fixed part of your character, where you're making plans to be compassionate. That's the highest form of love, and that's the raging fire of love that I argue for in the book. And then I try to go through the different texts of what I call the books of love and show that that's exactly what they teach. They teach that the highest form of love is the raging fire of love, where you act out of empathy or compassion for somebody in order to meet their needs.
Yeah, I really like the way you distinguish that. It did force me to reflect on my own life, my own actions, and how much of my love is second, third degree. you know, I like
Yeah.
these random
Well,
acts of
well, if we're
kindness or
honest, we got a lot of that in our. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I really had to look at it and like, where am I actually being deliberate? Like, I am going to go somewhere and do something today that is an act of love, versus people or animals, anybody in need that crosses my path, I help them. Whoever crosses my path, I help them, and I think that's second degree. I think that's where I have the intention of always loving, but it kind of if it crosses my path, it will happen.
So
Go ahead.
we order our lives so we don't get many people in need that cross our paths. We're not visiting the hospital. We don't go to the
Yes.
prison.
Mhm.
And all three of the traditions say that you should love the prisoner, but most of us avoid prisoners. We roll our windows up when we see a beggar. We avoid the eye contact with the beggar. So it, we'll do it if we have to. But I know I'm not very good at giving to beggars. I'll just confess. So and there are just lots of ways where our lives are organized so that we don't have to intentionally act in compassion. And I think all three traditions are trying to tell us, "No, you need to organize your life in ways where you do notice the poor, the widow, and the orphan, and you care about them, and you you don't stop until you meet their need."
And that would be a reflection or an expression of divine love, like how God loves us. Whether we're acting loving or not, to me, God is love and is always loving regardless. That's how I look at it. And so that we are called to love in that way, that we love regardless, whether it's deserving or not. But then this is going above and beyond and saying, like, what am I going to do today to go out and be love on this
Yeah,
planet
yeah,
deliberately?
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right, we don't organize our lives that way. We can sit back and go, "Well, I'm a loving person, I'm compassionate, I this, I that." But, the people who are out there I know a lot of people who are in animal rescue, and I know that they are actually actively really trying to help animals in need, and their whole life is that, and it's really, really
yeah,
admirable. And then there are the people who donate or who volunteer and all of that, that's also contributing. But the actual person who's like, kind of like on the front line doing the work, that's that raging fire that you're talking about.
yeah, yeah. Like, I'm not saying everybody needs to go out and risk their lives, although I do think love is risky business, and I try to make that point in the book. But, Doctors Without Borders, who are a doctor in the United States could stay here and make, $500,000 a year and live super comfortably. The Doctors Without Borders, some of them are in, uh, Gaza and are being shot at, and some are being killed. The chefs that go and cook food, for poor
Mhm,
people, and
mhm.
not everyone needs to be in a war zone. I that's not my point, but boy, we should be trying a lot harder. That's my point.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and that's a really good comparison. What came to my mind is my middle daughter's an attorney, and yeah, attorneys can go make hundreds of thousands of dollars in a firm. But she does this legal aid for the indigent, legal aid for the aging and the disabled, and it doesn't pay a lot, but it is noble work and it is an act of
Yeah,
love.
yeah.
So I like that you brought that up because that made me think about her
I
word.
just
But
wanna
I
since
want,
we're talking about daughters and love, let me just my
yeah.
daughter lived for 6 years in the Middle East, as I said. Well, she was paid peanuts, worked for a local NGO in Jordan, which they don't make much money, but the NGO created jobs, mostly for women in places where there weren't jobs, and they did it by opening up tourism. Um, so there were Roman ruins in a city, and they created more opportunities for women. They created a bed and breakfast there, so you could go to a woman's house and have a meal on the floor. A woman came and brought breakfast. They did cleanup. Now they all sound sexist, but one went wicker baskets and taught people how to do it. There was someone who had bees, a beekeeper, and made honey so they could sell the baskets. They could teach people to make the baskets. There were classes, and these were people that had no income whatsoever. And by the time they were done with this project, over 100 women had jobs, and one cent was able in 6 months to pay for her daughter to go to college, the first in
Oh, wow.
any college. Now, my daughter made peanuts, and I told her you can't do that forever because you have to have health insurance and save for retirement. And she works for another NGO now, but it's in the US and she makes more money than that. Anyway, there's lots of cool ways to show love that we have never imagined. I didn't know you could create jobs through tourism that show
Yes.
compassion to women who are disempowered in countries where they're disempowered, which is really every country by and large, by the way, even the US, women are relatively disempowered. They're also relatively empowered compared to third world countries or developing countries, but we haven't ironed out all the kinks, even
Mhm.
in our country.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, that's a great example of the raging fire. I was saying I was gonna give you the last word, but before we do that, I really am interested in how you had the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu recommend your book and write forwards for it. So how did that come to be?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with Desmond Tutu, which is the most remarkable since he passed away 2 years ago. He wrote a blurb um, for a book I wrote maybe 15 years ago, and it was a book that Yale University Press published called Abraham's Children, and it had essays by 5 prominent Muslims, Christians, and Jews. One of the Christians was Jimmy Carter, one of the Muslims was the former president of Indonesia, and they were essays on compassion and peace. And he wrote a blurb for that, but I got his email address because some of the co-authors were winners of peace awards. None of them had won the Nobel Peace Prize, but they were friends with Nobel Peace Prize winners because they had also won the other peace award. So I had emails addresses of 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners that I contacted. I got from my friends in the book, and they gave me Desmond Tutu's email address. So I had his personal email address. So I wrote to him and asked him to write a blurb for the book, and he wrote back and he said, "Well, I'm 85. I really don't think I can get to this. I think it's a really good idea. I'm glad for what you do, but well, let me think about it." And then he signed it, Love Arch. So I I feel like I always have that going for me. Love Arch from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And he did end up writing a blurb. So I went back to him with a draft before he passed away, a few months before he passed away, and we were in email correspondence. And he was thinking about writing a blurb. And then it took me almost 2 years to work out with his family because I didn't want to contact him immediately to say, "Can I have his endorsement?" And anyway, it took 2 years to agree to what was said and how it would be in the book. The Dalai Lama, I have never met, but, the Fetzer Foundation funded the writing of a white paper on this topic. My work for with on the topic, my first work on the topic is a white paper, and there was someone who knows the Dalai Lama in a discussion group. We had 2 groups that met for 6 hours to discuss the content of my book, and I contacted him multiple times, actually, and then he finally put me in touch with the Dalai Lama's assistant. And I actually tried to write something that the Dalai Lama would just have to sign it, and so I gave it to this guy, and he said, "Well, let me think about it," and he read the book, and he said, "I like this so much, I'm gonna recommend it to the Dalai Lama." And he or the Dalai Lama, I don't know who exactly wrote it, but I got something completely original from the Dalai Lama, and they really did like the book, and I don't know if they means that the Dalai Lama read the book, but his assistant it certainly was approved by him. He wouldn't put his name on anything he didn't approve.
Sure. So you got a love arch. Did you get a love doll?
Yeah, I love Dal. I should look a little more closely at my emails. They do things together.
Oh.
There are a couple videos of them. One is on Joy, I think, and you could see them calling each other Arch and Doll. And I could see
Okay, okay.
the Archbishop not taken too seriously that he's the Archbishop, and I could see him teasing the Dalai Lama about being His Holiness. But anyway, the videos are fun to watch. They really
Oh,
play
right
with
on.
each other in the video.
Oh gosh.
I think
Okay.
it's a
That's funny.
documentary. It's not a video, and I
Okay.
think it's on Joy is the topic.
Okay. So I do want to give you the last word in case we haven't covered anything that you want to say about your message and just I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll read, I'll just read, I'll read the last sentence of the book, so we'll give away the ending. So this is about raging fire of love. Such radical, other regarding love is our only hope for peace, a full and flourishing human community, the fulfillment of God's promise to bless all the world through the children of Abraham.
All the world. Yeah. Okay, Kelly, thank you so much for joining us and being a big light in this world for bringing more love to the planet. I think that's what it's all about. I love that we've gone from, groups of people to trying to understand other religions. For me, I think that love has no boundaries whatsoever. For me, the next boundary is the human species boundary, that we love all animals, all creation as God created all of it. So I think we're always really being challenged to be that raging fire for all beings
Yeah,
on the planet. And I appreciate your coming on and sharing about your book.
thank you. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. And I now close the Spiritual Forum.